the Legal Edition. I'm your host, Attorney Mary Kay Aloyan. Our show topic today is the next generation, from pipelines to propaganda, putting the best energy policies to work. Our guests include Massachusetts State Senator Jamie Eldridge. He's the Vice Chair of the Senate Committee on Global Warming and Climate Change and a member of the Joint Committee on Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy. We also have with us Jim O'Reilly. He is the Director of Public Policy at Northeast Energy Efficiency Partners. Welcome, gentlemen.
Morning.
Good morning, Mary Kay.
Great to have you with us. Now, Jim, can you address the status of review as to the energy requirements here in the Northeast? There's been a lot of discussion on that topic.
Sure. I guess the easiest way to think about this is that we're very dependent as a region on natural gas to generate a lot of our electricity. In fact, in terms of New England-wide electric generation basis, we're about half dependent on natural gas to make our electricity. And that's created some problems for us in recent years, particularly in the winter. On the coldest winter days, we have people competing for gas to heat their homes and businesses, and the power plants wanting that gas to generate electricity. Now, the people who heat with it, they have contracts, and so they're safe, and they're going to get that gas, and they're going to get it at a reasonable price. The difference is that the power generators don't have contracts, and so they have to bid for that on the open market. And on the coldest days, if you remember last winter, we had what we all now understood to be the polar vortex. On the few hours of those coldest days, we saw some precipitous price spikes on the price of electricity as a result of those power plants having to compete for that natural gas. And that's what we're looking at right now, is how do we best address that? The issue at hand, and I guess the reason we're here today, is that there's a proposal on the table to create a brand new gas pipeline through Massachusetts to serve the region. Primarily, its proponents will tell you to address those winter price spike issues. There is, however, a growing body of evidence that there should be some other alternatives that are assessed more fully before we commit to something that we as ratepayers and as citizens will be paying for to decades to come. And I guess that's what brings us here today is, what is the status of this pipeline? What could we consider as alternatives to it, and how should we be moving forward in that regard? Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the alternatives assessments,
yes,
the state has actually listened. A lot of its constituents have been making very clear to Senator Eldridge and his colleagues, as well as to Governor Patrick, that they believe that we should be looking at alternatives and assessing those before committing such a major financial undertaking as a pipeline to the ratepayers of not just Massachusetts, but New England as a whole. And so the state listened, and the Patrick administration just last month launched what they're calling a low-demand scenario assessment.
Yes, tell us about that.
Sure. That basically says, do we need this amount of gas that's being proposed, or are there some alternatives in which we could lower our energy demand and do so in a way that's much more cost-effective, less degrading to the environment, less risky in terms of the economic balance that we're putting on the backs of the ratepayers, and ultimately something that's easier to do and more effective in terms of meeting our energy needs. And so there is a consultancy that's been hired by the state that's looking at this in a much more open and transparent fashion than personally I believe had been the course to this point. Mm-hmm. And they're looking at things like energy efficiency and combined heat and power and market reforms and renewable energy and all kinds of different things that we could be doing instead of just simply bringing in more gas into the region. And by the way, we should also point out that that gas that we're talking about would be fracked gas from the Marcellus Shale fields of Pennsylvania.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that point up because a lot of the viewers aren't aware. And that Marcellus Shale is proposed to come through the state of New York, I understand, and follow the whole northeast corridor of Massachusetts, which I believe is also, under what I have learned, to be exported outside the state as well.
Well, the fact is that the winter price spike issues on the coldest winter peaking days are what's driving this discussion. Mm-hmm. Yet, if this new pipeline was built, there is no guarantee that that gas would go for electric generation. Once built, the company that's proposing this, Kinder Morgan, which is a subsidiary or a company that owns Tennessee Valley Gas, would be free to sell it wherever they want to. It wouldn't necessarily have to go for electric generation. So it could be converted to LNG, could be shipped overseas, it could be piped into the Canadian Maritimes. There's all kinds of things they could do with it. They'll tell you, frankly, that they are under no obligation to sell this to electric generators, and that, in fact, they can sell it anywhere in the market that'll pay them for it. So, unfortunately, this winter coming and the winter past are being used to really, I think, alarm people into the need for this pipeline when in fact this may not be the solution to the winter peak price spiking issues at all.
Exactly. That's what I've also heard. Now, Senator Eldridge, what have you heard from your constituents?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of concern, a lot of complaints, really from sort of two perspectives. Both of them opposed to the Kinder Morgan pipeline and just the general expansion of the state relying upon natural gas. Mm-hmm. The first is sort of a backyard perspective of constituents who don't want the pipeline going through their communities. The Kinder Morgan pipeline as proposed wouldn't go through any of the towns I represent. However, they would go just north, towns like Pepperell and Townsend and Groton. And I certainly hear from a lot of those folks, as well as just towns nearby that are concerned about being anywhere near the pipeline. And I think the concern is in that area there's a lot of open space. There's the Nashville River and just people's general property. They're very concerned about the pipeline, going through those communities and really ruining, part of why they moved to that area or lived there. So I think from sort of a property point of view, there's a real concern about the impact on how that will change the area. Mm-hmm. I think the other perspective, which I've heard from constituents all over my district, is just those who are committed to combating climate change, mm-hmm. that are really pleased with Governor Patrick's leadership on investing in solar and wind and energy efficiency, and are saying, wait a second, now we're actually considering a pipeline that actually would move the state backwards in terms mm-hmm. of its commitments to comply with the Global Warming Solutions mm-hmm. Act and reducing mm-hmm. CO2 emissions. Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing an incredible amount of advocacy about pushing back against the pipeline, about how that will set us backwards, mm-hmm. and saying, sort of as Jim referred to, isn't there an alternative plan? Can't we do mm-hmm. A mix here? And why do we have to go forward and just assume this is the only way to address the state's energy needs?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of my concerns is, I'm sure you've heard it yourself, being the vice chair of the Climate Change Committee, is gas is one of the most potent greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. It is very, very persistent. And we have taken that Massachusetts has that proposal we have to meet mm-hmm. in a time frame to curb right. greenhouse gases. So it seems to me that putting an infrastructure that's so permanent would be deleterious to the momentum that we've already achieved. And I know we're also number one in solar energy from having discussed that with mm-hmm. Senator Barrett as well. So the concerns that I hear from people who are knowledgeable about this is that mm-hmm. Look, this is supposed to go by the area that is the watershed for Massachusetts, mm-hmm. the main watershed for drinking water. Sure. Very sensitive areas. It's a highly volatile pipeline. Mm-hmm. I understand it's for storage as well as a delivery system with compressor stations along the way. This is not just, from what I understand, a regular pipeline. It is mm-hmm. a wide diameter with compressor stations, and it could, jeopardize the whole entire infrastructure that we have for our water supply. Another issue is terrorism. We live in a very different world today than we did prior mm-hmm. to, the World Trade Center.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And we have to take in consideration that, putting a pipeline is not just business as usual. Jim, do you have anything you would like to add about that particular issue, about, the water and the path of that? And then Senator Eldridge can chime in.
I actually might take an alternative perspective to that, Mary Kay. Mm-hmm. And I say that both as an advocate for clean energy and also a resident of one of the towns that's in the proposed pathway of this pipeline. I've heard people say, can't you locate this elsewhere? Can't it run along Route 2? Can't it run along the Mass Pike corridor? My answer to that is it's not that it shouldn't be in someone's backyard. I'm not sure it should be in any of our backyards mm-hmm. because I don't know, quite honestly, whether we have done the appropriate assessments of alternatives to this.
Good point.
And I think that's where we really have sort of fallen down, and where I think the administration has caught itself and sought to correct this, is that they are looking for these alternatives and assessing those so that we're actually not going into this blind. If we are, as I mentioned, about half dependent on electricity for our natural gas, that would seem to be a strategy that's quite risky. Think about it from a portfolio perspective, as investors, as we all might be, whether it's our own 401k or whatever the case is. If you become overly dependent on a single source, you are really opening yourself up to economic risk. If we're overly committed to a generating source, much more so than others, aren't we opening ourselves up to that same sort of risk? And if that's the case, the normal reaction is diversify. so that you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. Yet if we build this pipeline, we are saying we are going to put more eggs in that same basket, this natural gas basket. And isn't that opening us up to further risk? I would suggest that perhaps it is, but we don't really know until we've done that full and thorough assessment, and that hasn't happened. So far, the only assessment that really has been the driving force behind this is one that was done by a consultancy called Black & Veatch.
Oh, tell us about that.
Sure. This is a very old energy consulting and management firm. They've been involved in developing natural gas pipeline projects for years and years and years. And they were hired by an entity called the New England States Committee on Electricity, or NESCO. And ostensibly, this is an organization that was set up to represent the governors into the regional energy markets discussions with ISO New England.
The 6 New England governors.
The 6 New England governors, right. And what happened was NESCO was making the decisions based on this study done by this company, Black & Veatch, which said 2 things. One, it said, we think we need this pipeline to meet our regional energy needs. But in the fine print of that study, it also said, if you looked at a low demand scenario, one in which we reduced our need for natural gas, that would obviate the need for this pipeline. Now, Black & Veatch didn't do that scenario. And it
Why not?
It was largely because my understanding is that NESCO did not ask them to do that scenario. Now, what's a little bit disturbing is that NESCO is representative of these New England governors, yet they are holding out that they are not necessarily a public entity and subject, for example, to public records laws. They were asked by Conservation Law Foundation if they would provide them with records of their conversations which were driving this discussion on the need for this pipeline, and NESCO refused.
Really?
They claim they are not a public entity. They are simply representatives of the governors and therefore are not subject to these open record laws. Now, thankfully, we did see some of the states represented as part of this group, specifically the state of New Hampshire, agree to open up their records and provide some of the information about these communications. And what was in it was very interesting. It did show that largely the discussions around this pipeline were being driven by gas companies, gas interests, large industrial users, no environmental advocates, no representatives of the state legislature, which is really amazing when you think of that.
It is amazing.
And so this whole thing was being done in a way that did not have a lot of public light being shown
Very
upon it.
clandestine, it sounds to me.
Yeah, well, okay, you're a lawyer, you can use that term. I would say probably not helpful from the perspective of trying to build public trust.
Right.
And if you have such a major project as this in which you're trying to get people to accept this, especially something that's going to be what's called a greenfields pipeline, new construction, going through, as the senator pointed out, environmentally sensitive areas, people's yards, private properties, public areas such as schools, you would certainly, I would think, want to have much more public light shown onto that process, and that didn't happen. So again, I'll give a lot of credit to the Patrick administration. They may be a little late to the table, but based on marches that people had to the State House and protests that have been taking place on a community-by-community basis, they have listened and they have agreed to perform this alternative analysis. Now, this alternative analysis may show that the best solution is this pipeline. We don't know. But that's the whole point. Until you do these kind of studies, how can you expect to gain the public's trust and the public's confidence that the process is actually one that's in their best interests? And so hopefully that's something that we'll gain out of this, is that we'll see some of these alternatives, but more than that, we'll maybe hopefully regain the public trust in the process.
Well, basically, I want to ask the both of you, and either one of you can answer. Well, if there has not been a definitive study, then why has there been already a filing with FERC, the Federal Energy Resource Council?
Yeah, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has certain requirements in place that for example, have suggested that for Kinder Morgan, they've done what's known as a pre-filing, or almost a pre-pre-filing, if you would, if that doesn't sound too ridiculous to say it that way. They haven't put forth their full proposal at this point. And one of the reasons why is that it's still not clear who will pay for this. One of the things that has been floated as a proposal for funding this pipeline has been a tariff or an assessment on all electric ratepayers in all 6 New England states.
Well, wait a minute, isn't that unprecedented?
Would be unprecedented.
In the
Never happened
United
in U.S.
States.
history before that you would ask electric ratepayers to pay for a gas pipeline infrastructure project.
So you can sell your gas to whoever you want.
Well, that potentially could be the outcome of it, is that the electric ratepayers could pay for it without a guarantee that it would necessarily go to electric generation. Again, one of the risky things that we're still not fully certain of, because we haven't really run through the entire thing in all its ramifications for the citizens and businesses of New England. So, you know, and this is another issue that goes beyond Massachusetts. This is really a region-wide thing, because we're part of a regional electric market in New England. And so if that's the case, all the ratepayers would be asked to pay for this sort of thing. One of the things that this raises as an inconsistency is that right now, if that did come to pass, you would have all the ratepayers sharing the cost of this supply-side infrastructure project. Yet conversely, if any state wanted to invest in demand-side energy projects, such as energy efficiency, either gas or electric, only the individual states are asked to bear that cost themselves. That can't be socialized around the region.
I see.
Which seems to be an inherent inconsistency in
Yes,
energy
it does.
policy, because that means we're saying we'll share the cost for supply, but not necessarily the cost for demand-side resources, which we know are cleaner, cheaper, and quicker to deploy. So if that's the case, why wouldn't we make it easier for those resources to be the ones that we can share across New England instead of just the supply-side resources? Again, just one more thing that I think we need to take a closer look at.
Sure. Senator Eldridge, what have you heard from your committees? You're on the Climate Change Committee and you're on the Energy Committees. There been a lot of talk amongst the members? What's kind of the word?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is that the work of the legislature, especially the committees I serve on, was requiring utility companies to purchase more alternative energy, whether it's hydro or solar or wind. So the legislature is still very focused on alternatives, and so I think that's why it took all of us a little bit. We're taken a little bit aback that it was this idea to rely more upon a fossil fuel such as natural gas. The legislature as a whole, we've had a couple of hearings on it. We're not in session right now. I think it's something we'll look at more closely in the next session. But I think what has happened is a number of legislators, really from Western Mass, because of course this pipeline would go from Western Mass all the way, through Massachusetts, through the east. Legislators from Western Mass, Central Mass, Merrimack Valley, Metro West, almost all of them have signed on to a letter opposing and raising concerns about this pipeline and saying, what about the alternatives? And I think Jim makes some excellent points about, making sure this alternative study is done. I think also, and this is something that the Conservation Law Foundation is really focused on, is of course, part of Massachusetts' commitment to combating climate change was reducing demand. Is doing the educational outreach, passing the policies to reduce our use of electricity and general energy. And I think that's something that, as much as we've made a lot of progress in Massachusetts, we need to do even more, because if we can reduce that demand across the state, the need for this additional energy source, whether it's natural gas or other source of energy, will be significantly reduced. And that's really the most efficient way to reduce our energy use, is actually not to have that surge in demand. So I think that's something that, as much as Governor Patrick has really moved the state to #1 in the nation, clearly we need to do much, much more, and that's something that the legislature and the next governor will have to tackle.
Right, and also too, I wanted to bring out the point. One of my former guests, Dr. Ingrafia, he, a scientist from Cornell University, he has proposed what's called the Solutions Project. And that Solutions Project is quite interesting. It's how to get every state in the entire U.S. totally renewable energy driven by using the technologies we have and the technologies that will be coming on within the next few years. Jim, I don't know if you've dealt with any of this or you've heard any word. I know that's not your expertise, but I was just wondering if you had heard anything about the Solutions Project.
I've heard a little bit of it, Mary Kay. I'm not intimately familiar with it, so I wouldn't pretend to want to speak about it. But what I can speak about is the fact that, as a state, the policies in Massachusetts have been highly progressive in trying to, as the senator said, capture these alternative resources that are available to us. And we've done a terrific job with that. Under Governor Patrick's leadership, with the support of the legislature, in no small measure to people like Senator Eldridge, we have some very progressive energy policies on the books right now.
Some of the most progressive in the U.S.
Absolutely. And whether it's energy efficiency or renewable energy, we're really leaders in that regard, which is one reason why, again, to echo the senator's point, it would be really disappointing to backslide on some of this. If we've made the commitments to energy efficiency that we have, if we've made the commitments to renewable energy,
and
solar and wind, we have some issues with that, but we can talk about that another day. If we've made the commitments that we have to some of these alternative resources through our renewable portfolio standard and combined heat and power and some of the other things that we know are cleaner and more easily deployed, and by the way, better for the ratepayer because they're more economical in both the short and the long term, why would we then want to backslide on those at this point in time? This administration is soon to be out of office. We know that. And I would say probably more so than any in my memory and maybe in the entire history of the Commonwealth, the policies that have been enacted in terms of supporting clean energy during this administration have been the best that have ever happened in the history of this Commonwealth. And it would be a terrible shame
to lose that momentum,
that legacy to be lost with something that is being based upon what I would suggest respectfully is insufficient analysis.
Right.
If we've made these commitments to clean energy as we have, if we've made these commitments to reducing greenhouse gases, in one fell swoop, quite frankly, we could lose pretty much all of that. If we commit to doing something that hog-ties us in the long term to fossil fuel. You know, it's akin to saying if you're a drug addict and you're on a certain drug, why would you give somebody more of that? Let's
Right.
start weaning ourselves off of that to the things that we know are going to be healthier for us in the long term, economically and environmentally.
Yes, and also too. Excuse me, Senator.
sure.
When I spoke to Senator Barrett, he had mentioned
Yeah.
healthcare costs as well. Did you want to?
Well, I just wanted to add upon what Jim said just about the Doctor Solutions Project. I'm not that familiar with it, but I think the idea of committing to every state, just being reliant upon renewables, it's important to highlight the economic benefits of that. Yeah. Is that if we rely on oil or coal or natural gas, none of which are underground in Massachusetts, it's not going to create the jobs that renewables
Right.
already do. If you think about investing in solar, that's creating jobs for engineers, for architects, for people that are installing the solar panels on homes and on buildings and on properties. If you're talking about wind, there's an incredible market which I hope happens once the Cape Wind is built.
Cape Wind,
for
right.
creating a lot of construction jobs and a lot of jobs constructing the actual turbines. So it's jobs that will stay in Massachusetts, and I think that's one of the key things that sometimes the energy companies are rather disingenuous about, is suggesting that a pipeline will create lots of jobs here in Massachusetts. I respectfully disagree, and I think if anything, moving on renewables is a much more sustainable path towards creating jobs that will stay here for many, many years to come.
Right, and to take that point further, Senator, if you have the renewable energies in each and every state, you're not only creating jobs in each and every state, you're creating an infrastructure that's going to pour more money into the economy.
Absolutely.
In each and every state. So I just can't see how putting a pipeline, which is old technology in my book, and something that creates additional healthcare costs because of the methane, the greenhouse gases that are going to be added to the atmosphere. I just don't see where we're going with this. And also, too, I understand that Governor Patrick has backed away from his initial proposal of this pipeline. Did you hear anything of that on the Hill?
Yeah, I mean, I was part of the effort to push back against what initially the New England governors, including Governor Patrick, were going to sign on to. Jim's made reference to it. So, whether it's organizations like NEEP, groups like 350.org, or legislators that are very focused on combating climate change, as a group, we were really pushing back against that. And I appreciate, Governor Patrick's, decision to take a step back. It did require people marching all the way from Western Mass to the State House, which was amazing to see. So it shows how passionate people in Massachusetts are about protecting the environment and doing the right thing on energy policy. So I really hope that continues as far as public policy decisions that happen at the state level.
Yeah, one of my concerns is we're in the throes of, we're going to get a new governor, whoever that may be, and I don't know exactly where each and every one stands on that particular issue, on the pipeline issue. I think I heard from one of the, I think it was Martha Coakley, said that she was against that.
She has stated she's in opposition to the Kinder Morgan pipeline, yes.
And is Charlie Baker? I'm not sure.
I'm a little less clear, quite frankly, because I think he's indicated that for him, he would not look at it as a first option or a first resort. But I think that seemed to leave the door open just a little bit.
For the pipeline.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about the Solutions Project, and we also talked about the tariff. Were there any specifics that were given as to this tariff? Massachusetts being the T, we threw the T in the harbor a long time ago because of a tariff. Here's that word popping up again. Do either one of you want to comment on the tariff?
Well, it would be unprecedented because you'd be asking for electric ratepayers to pay for a gas infrastructure project. Now, this had a lot of momentum at the initial stages of this proposal. My understanding is that it's sort of lost a little of that momentum. And I think that's not a bad thing, because it gives us a chance to pause and say, exactly what would this mean for all the ratepayers of all New England, not just Massachusetts. I will say this, that I firmly believe this governor had every good intention in examining a regional energy policy, as the Senator referenced, with the other 5 New England governors. I think they all recognized that we were looking at some sort of very potentially harmful circumstances in terms of our energy policies. And they got together last December and they signed a regional compact which says we will work in unison to promote some regional solutions. What I'm less certain about is, was the governor getting the best information that was available to him to make the decisions that he made about, for example, initially supporting this pipeline? The governor will tell you he never came out one way or another and said yes or no on it, but all indications were that it was something that the administration was going to support. In the initial phases of the Clean Energy Resources Bill, which Senator Eldridge I know is very familiar with, which did not end up passing this last session, there was language in there that would have allowed the state to enter into this regional compact to create this tariff for the pipeline. When there was some pushback, they removed that from that legislation. But nonetheless, that means we saw some initial indications from the administration that it was supportive of those measures. Again, I'll give him credit for listening. They did hear what some of his leadership in the legislature was saying, as well as what some of the people across the Commonwealth were saying about the fact that we wanted to see something else examined. You can make the argument, and honestly, I guess I would firmly come down on this side as well, that we are going to probably need some more natural gas to come in and serve our region. But here's the thing. There are at least 3 other pipeline proposals that are already much further along in the federal review process than the Kinder Morgan proposal. And these are ones that don't require new greenfields construction of pipelines. It's simply expansion of existing pipelines. And if we can take a look at what those will mean in terms of meeting our winter energy needs, and couple that with more energy efficiency
and renewables,
and more renewable energy and more combined heat and power, and by the way, some reforms to our markets. That's one of the things that's been sort of missing in this whole discussion, is that our gas and electricity markets are not aligned. And if you're reliant on one fuel in order to be able to drive the generation of another one, we really have to get those markets much more closely aligned. So there are at least 3 proposals before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission right now to do just that, to make these markets work better in sync. If we can take all of those things together, and if we put those into a grinder and what comes out is a solution that says it's more economical for us to do those alternatives, it's less environmentally degrading, it's quicker in terms of helping us meet our regional energy needs, the question is why wouldn't we pursue those as opposed to this other solution?
Well, I hope somebody's looking at using the infrastructure we already have in place. I hope that's being looked at. Senator, any final words you'd like to say about any of the discussion?
Well, I think this discussion we had reflects the fact that energy policy is very complex, and I think that was one of the things that surprised a lot of us, is just this idea of just continuing to rely upon expanding our reliance on natural gas. It's a very simple proposal in the sense that it doesn't reflect the complexities of energy policies and contracts and what the state is doing as far as public policy. So I'm glad that the governor's Patrick has taken a step back, and I think what you'll see in the next session is the legislature getting more involved as far as what is the path to becoming a state where we are just using renewables, and that's something that I'm very excited about. And I think when you talk to the average person, they're committed to that vision as well. So let's focus on that vision and not what Kinder Morgan had initially proposed.
Great. Well, thank you, Senator, for being with
Thank
us. Thank you, Jim. I want to thank our guests, Senator James Eldridge, Jim O'Reilly, for sharing their insights on these important issues of energy generation and delivery. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on these topics and our guests, please visit The Legal Edition at thelegaledition.com. And as always, this information is for general educational purposes only, is not to be construed or relied upon as legal or business advice. And please consult a professional advisor as to your particular legal or energy needs. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on The Legal Edition.